Part 1. The Fall of the Berlin Wall, a calm retrospective for restful nights. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight we begin with a story that, despite its monumental significance, we'll treat gently, like a soft history lullaby. So, find a comfortable spot, maybe dim the lights, settle into your favorite chair, or just curl up in bed. This is going to be a calm ride through time, exploring not the noise of events, but the quiet human moments behind one of the most famous symbols of division in modern history. Imagine Europe in the late 1980s. There was tension in the air, sure, but let's not over-dramatize. Think of it more like a slowly simmering pot than a roaring fire. And in the middle of it all was Berlin, a city literally split in half, not by choice, but by walls, fences, and checkpoints, patrolled by people who may have looked bored, tired, or mildly annoyed at their daily routine. Life on either side of the wall was in many ways a study in contrasts that could lull even the most restless mind to reflection. The Berlin Wall itself had been erected in 1961. And if you picture it, don't imagine a single structure. It was actually a patchwork of concrete slabs, barbed wire, watchtowers, and eventually a strip of sand known as the Death Strip. Yes, the name sounds dramatic, but we're not going to dwell on drama tonight. Just note that the wall was the most visible, tangible boundary separating two ideologies, the socialist East and the capitalist West. Now let's float over to East Berlin, where daily life was, in its own way, a gentle monotony. People woke up, took the tram, walked past grey apartment blocks that smelled faintly of boiled cabbage or fresh paint, and perhaps muttered about the latest shortages at the grocery store. Milk might be scarce, yes, but bread was usually available. Sometimes butter was an adventure. And yet, people adapted. They formed routines, habits, little quirks that would feel familiar to anyone anywhere who had learned to live within limitations. A neighbor might sneak a small treat past the grocery line for a friend. A child might memorize the train schedule, just in case. Nothing heroic, nothing tragic, just quiet human perseverance. Meanwhile, in West Berlin, life had a slightly different flavor. There were cafes, neon signs, music that wasn't entirely state-approved, and shops that offered exotic fruits, though sometimes just once a week. People in the West looked over at the wall and perhaps felt a mix of pity and curiosity. Sometimes they waved, sometimes they just went on with their coffee. The wall, after all, was a backdrop to the everyday. It wasn't a constant crisis. It was, for the most part, a grey, omnipresent neighbor that everyone learned to live with. Let's take a moment to consider the people behind the politics. East German leaders, for example. Erich Honecker was the General Secretary of the Socialist Unity Party. He had a reputation for being rigid, loyal to the system, and fond of wearing suits that were a bit too big, as though the fabric itself could lend him authority. He might meet with advisors, listen carefully, nod seriously, and then return to his office to make decisions that seemed monumental, but were often executed with the same monotone bureaucratic precision that defined the entire East German government. And while historians debate his motives, let's picture him calmly drinking his tea, looking out over the city, probably wondering how long he could maintain control without anyone noticing that the world outside had begun to drift away. Meanwhile, in West Berlin, the mayor had his own challenges. West Berlin was an isolated enclave surrounded by East Germany. Logistics were tricky. Supply lines had to be maintained. People crossed borders with passes, paperwork, and occasional sighs of exasperation. Life was bureaucratic too, but with a slightly brighter veneer. And just like in the East, ordinary people found ways to navigate the system. Some would smuggle chocolates or newspapers, others might exchange small favors with friends across the checkpoint. It was a city divided, yes, but also quietly human. The late 1980s brought change, though it didn't announce itself with fanfare. Policies in the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev, perestroika, and glasnost offered a subtle invitation to reconsider rigidity. East German leaders were watching, sipping coffee, adjusting speeches, and wondering if, perhaps, it was time to tweak the system just a little. People on the streets noticed too. Maybe it was a newspaper headline that seemed slightly more hopeful. Maybe it was a neighbor's story about a cousin who had visited abroad. Change in this sleepy story arrived like a breeze rather than a storm. One could imagine ordinary East Germans walking through the city, perhaps glancing at the wall, noticing the posters, the propaganda, and thinking, well, this has been the background of my life for decades, it will probably continue. Life carried on. Children played in courtyards, market stalls sold cucumbers and sausages, people queued for buses and sometimes for bread. And somewhere along the way, a quiet sense of anticipation, barely perceptible, began to build. By 1989, the situation had gently intensified. Demonstrations occurred, but they were often organized with methodical, almost sleepy persistence. People held signs, chanted slogans, and then went home. There was no need for hyperbole. The wall was already an object lesson in patience. Citizens wanted change, yes, but in that calm European way that involved paperwork, petitions, and repeated polite requests. East German officials, in turn, juggled internal debates. Should we ease restrictions? Should we allow travel? Should we maintain the same old policies and hope the world doesn't notice that they're slowly eroding? And so they held meetings, adjusted memos, and occasionally glanced at international news broadcasts, trying not to seem too anxious. And then, on November 9, 1989, something quietly remarkable happened. A bureaucratic miscommunication. Yes, just a little mix-up in wording at a press conference led to the announcement that East Germans could cross the border freely. Imagine the calm confusion of officials. One could imagine them sipping tea, reading the teleprinter, and thinking, well, that wasn't exactly what we intended. East Germans, upon hearing this, didn't rush immediately. People were cautious, tentative. Maybe they had imagined such an opportunity for decades, and yet it seemed surreal now. Slowly they gathered near checkpoints, chatting, asking questions, showing identification. Guards, equally unsure, hesitated, blinked, and eventually stepped aside. And so began the process of crossing the wall. Not in a frenzy, not in dramatic heroics, but in quiet human increments. There were celebrations, yes, but even these were soft, like a shared sigh of relief. People hugged friends they hadn't seen in years. Children climbed onto the concrete slabs, touching the wall that had been part of their lives for so long. Some took hammers and chisels, carefully, not with urgency, just to leave a small mark. And tourists and locals alike marveled at the sudden accessibility of a city that had once been so divided. The wall, which had been an intimidating monolith for nearly 30 decades, became an object of curiosity, art, and mild demolition. In the following weeks, the city experienced what one might call a slow awakening. Cafes on both sides began to welcome new customers. Trains and buses ran schedules that felt slightly less rigid. Families reunited with hugs that were neither exaggerated nor frantic, just quietly warm. And even politicians adjusted speeches, acknowledging the moment with a calm sense of inevitability. History had happened, but it had happened gently, like a long sigh of relief. And so, as we drift through this story tonight, think of the wall not as a dramatic symbol, but a human-made rhythm, a pulse of life that separated and yet connected. Its fall was less about explosions and more about patience, quiet courage, and bureaucratic mishaps that turned out to be serendipitous. People moved, adapted, and carried on. The city breathed a little easier, the sky seemed a touch more open, and the world, though still complicated, had a moment of calm clarity. So let's leave East and West Berlin here for now, floating slowly over streets where everyday life continues, now uninterrupted by concrete and barbed wire. Picture families, children, commuters, and officials, all navigating a new normal, gently, methodically, almost imperceptibly. There are no grand speeches to memorize here, no battles to recount, just the soft rhythm of life adjusted to new boundaries, or the lack of them, and the quiet wonder of watching a city heal itself in its own time. And that, friends, is where we'll pause for tonight. We've walked through decades of cautious existence, observed leaders sipping tea, citizens queuing for bread, and the wall itself.
Part 2. Life after the wall. Quiet adjustments in a slowly healing city. Welcome back, friends. If you're still settled in your favorite chair or tucked into bed, that's perfect. Let's continue floating through the gentle history of Berlin after the wall began to fall, when everyday life slowly shifted, like clouds drifting across a quiet sky. There's no rush, no dramatic urgency, just people, routines, and the subtle human rhythms of a city learning to stitch itself back together. After November 9th, 1989, Berliners on both sides of the former divide discovered a reality that was, in its own way, both thrilling and slightly awkward. Imagine families who had spent decades apart, suddenly able to see each other without forms, permits, or bureaucratic approvals. Picture grandparents meeting grandchildren for the first time in years, trying to remember what the other looked like without the occasional visit in mind. It's a heartwarming thought, but remember, we're taking this slow. The reunions were calm, deliberate, like people testing the water before jumping in. Some neighbors simply exchanged shy smiles and cautious hellos, unsure if decades of separation could be bridged with a handshake. Let's consider the guards, too. Those who had stood at checkpoints for years suddenly faced a unique predicament. They were trained for suspicion, for monitoring, for a kind of enforced vigilance that had been the core of their daily existence. And now, people were walking past. Some smiled, some blinked, uncertain. Some, perhaps, briefly wondered if they had misread the new rules and were about to be scolded. But of course, nobody was. The wall had quietly lost its power over daily life, and the guards, who had been pillars of its authority, now found themselves slowly easing into civilian roles, sometimes selling small souvenirs to curious passers-by, or simply sitting on benches, sipping coffee and observing the city without a strict order to enforce. Businesses on both sides adjusted too. In East Berlin, small shops and kiosks that had long relied on predictable supplies suddenly had new items to consider. Chocolate from the West, fruit from places previously inaccessible, newspapers with international coverage, they all arrived like gentle intruders into a familiar routine. Shopkeepers had to figure out prices, inventory, and customer reactions, often in the quiet way that bureaucratic Europeans handle change, meticulously, patiently, with occasional sighs. Meanwhile, West Berlin experienced its own adjustments. Businesses were curious and cautious about the influx of East Berliners. Cafes noticed new customers who ordered things they hadn't seen before, perhaps tea instead of coffee, or bread rolls instead of croissants. Train and bus operators recalculated schedules, sometimes multiple times, ensuring that connections worked smoothly for people who were now commuting in ways that had previously seemed impossible. And in both halves of the city, ordinary people, workers, students, retirees, began to navigate this new world, tentatively forming new friendships, exploring streets that had been inaccessible for decades, and slowly building a shared urban life that would eventually feel normal, though at first it felt slightly surreal. Now let's drift over to the political arena. East German officials faced a uniquely slow kind of panic. On one hand, there was excitement, reform, and international scrutiny. On the other hand, there was decades' worth of administrative habit, protocols, and paperwork. Imagine a room full of bureaucrats, pens in hand, hovering over forms that suddenly seemed irrelevant, trying to adjust language, policies, and even internal memos to a rapidly changing reality. They held meetings, nodded gravely, and occasionally paused for tea, realizing that some rules they had upheld for decades no longer applied. And yes, even here, there's a faint hint of humor. Some officials reportedly took long walks along the wall, observing citizens smashing concrete with small hammers, and thought, well, this is an unusual kind of civic maintenance. On the social side, daily life had its own quiet transformations. Families explored neighborhoods that had previously been mysterious or off-limits. Children played in spaces that once belonged to the other side, marveling at the differences in architecture, playground equipment, and street signs. Teenagers discovered new cafes and music shops, listening to albums that had been scarce in the East, and occasionally sharing them with friends in a careful, hushed enthusiasm. Adults found themselves adjusting commuting routes, exchanging casual greetings with former strangers, and slowly weaving a network of urban interaction that would over time feel completely ordinary. It's worth pausing here to reflect on the human resilience embedded in these small changes. No grand heroics, no monumental speeches, just people adjusting. Elderly neighbors helped each other across streets that had been divided by concrete for decades. Young couples discovered new parks, newly accessible, and strolled in quiet curiosity. Students from East Berlin attended universities in the West, taking notes carefully, sometimes blinking at the abundance of stationery and books that had seemed like treasures before. Life unfolded slowly, methodically, with minor frustrations and gentle delights interspersed along the way. Even cultural life had its subtle awakenings. Museums in the West opened exhibitions to East Berliners, who wandered quietly, observing artworks that had been unavailable to them, sometimes with surprise, sometimes with understated admiration. Theaters adjusted ticketing procedures to accommodate a larger audience, quietly noting the differences in taste, pace, and expectation. And musical concerts, previously divided by ideology and access, now had audiences who were attentive but not frenzied, just people settling into a new cultural rhythm. Perhaps most fascinatingly, there was a quiet reconciliation with the physical structure of the wall itself. Concrete slabs became canvases for graffiti artists, yes, but in a leisurely, measured way. Messages ranged from humorous to reflective, from lightly sarcastic to gently ironic. "Finally got out," one slab read. "We were getting tired of standing in line," said another. People took small hammers to the wall, not with rage or urgency, but with deliberate curiosity, creating souvenirs, photographs, and keepsakes. The wall became simultaneously a relic, a playground, and a museum, all coexisting in the soft urban landscape. Political developments continued gently over the following months. Negotiations for reunification were slow, methodical, and sometimes even boring to follow, but in a comforting way. Leaders from East and West Germany, along with their international counterparts, met in rooms, discussed policies, and occasionally paused to drink tea or coffee. Agreements were reached incrementally, often requiring multiple drafts, revisions, and footnotes. And throughout, ordinary citizens went about their lives, observing, adapting, and occasionally rolling their eyes at bureaucratic verbosity, which, let's be honest, had always been part of the German way. Let's not forget the subtle economic adjustments. Prices, wages, and employment structures shifted, slowly, like a tide creeping along a calm shore. Some East Berliners found work in new industries. Others pursued education, curious about opportunities they hadn't had before. Shops stocked new items, and slowly people recalibrated their...
Part 3. Personal Lives and Cultural Shifts, Berlin's Gentle Reawakening. Welcome back, friends. If you're still cozy with the lights dimmed and the world softened around you, that's perfect. Tonight, we drift deeper into Berlin after the walls fall. We're not rushing. We're not chasing dramatic events. Instead, we'll observe ordinary lives, quiet cultural shifts, and the subtle ways a city slowly reclaims itself. Think of this as a gentle stroll through history, rather than a sprint. Let's start with families, who were at the heart of Berlin's slow transformation. After decades of separation, parents and children, siblings and cousins began reconnecting in unhurried, careful ways. Imagine an East Berlin mother cautiously approaching a cafe she'd only ever seen from across the wall. She orders a coffee, maybe a slice of cake, and waits, silently wondering if her West Berlin cousin will arrive for a visit. When they finally meet, it's not an overwhelming embrace, not a cinematic reunion. It's a quiet acknowledgement. Yes, we're here, together, at last. And that small, unassuming moment is already monumental in its own understated way. Children adapted remarkably well, of course. Streets that had once felt like alien territories became playgrounds, not battlefields. Kids from the West discovered courtyards where children from the East had built makeshift games. The differences in playground equipment were noted with gentle curiosity. A slide here, a swing there, a sandbox slightly too small, or a basketball hoop leaning at an odd angle. And yet, they played. Slowly, cautiously at first, then with growing comfort, like young historians of urban life, mapping out a city they were learning to share. Teenagers, naturally, found their own paths to cultural exploration. Western music, which had previously filtered slowly into East Berlin through tapes, radio signals, and occasional smuggled records, now flooded more openly. Students walked into shops filled with CDs, posters, and magazines, eyes widening slightly, perhaps muttering, "Well, this is new." Teachers adjusted, sometimes with mild exasperation, sometimes with quiet amusement, guiding lessons that now included foreign music, literature, and ideas, blending them gradually with existing curricula. Life was reorganizing itself, but in a measured, almost sleepy cadence. Let's not forget the culinary adventures, which are always important to note in any historical tale, East Berlin kitchens were suddenly graced with ingredients that had once been a rarity. Chocolate, coffee, oranges, pasta, all appeared in shops and markets, sometimes confusing shoppers accustomed to their old routines. Recipes slowly incorporated these new ingredients. Households experimented quietly, perhaps with a bit of skepticism. "Will this taste right?" someone might mutter. "Perhaps it's too sweet," said another. Yet, in these minor adjustments, the city was creating a subtle bridge between old and new, east and west. Neighborhoods, too, experienced gradual change. Streets that had once felt entirely alien now had neighbors strolling back and forth, exchanging greetings, or simply observing. East Berliners discovered Western bakeries, while Western Berliners wandered past formerly closed-off apartment blocks, marveling at the variety of architecture, the unexpected green spaces, and the subtle quirks of buildings that had aged differently on each side. And of course, graffiti, once an act of rebellion, became a playful, reflective art form on remaining sections of the wall. Messages ranged from ironic observations to slightly sarcastic remarks about bureaucracy. "Finally, free parking," or "We've waited long enough for this view." And some were simply poetic. Concrete cannot hold human curiosity. Quiet acts of humor emerged in everyday life as well. Shopkeepers in the East sometimes labeled new products with intentionally whimsical notes. Imported chocolate may cause excessive happiness. Cafe owners in the West welcomed visitors from the East with faintly exaggerated politeness, nodding with mild amusement when first-time patrons hesitated over coffee machines that they didn't recognize. These small gestures softened the transition and allowed a city to feel human again, not merely politically restructured. Political life, meanwhile, continued its slow evolution. West and East leaders negotiated reunification with meticulous care, often in lengthy meetings punctuated by pauses, note-taking, and occasional sips of coffee or tea. The process was deliberate, almost bureaucratically serene, with multiple drafts of treaties and policies, footnotes, and appendices. Occasionally, ministers would glance at one another, exchange a faintly sardonic smile, and note, quietly, that history was unfolding around them in a way they hadn't quite anticipated. But they adjusted, because that's what polite bureaucrats do. Even economic life adjusted slowly, with a rhythm of its own. Shops recalibrated prices, job markets gradually opened. Banks offered new accounts, sometimes confusing citizens who had previously relied on simpler systems. And people adapted. East Berliners learned to navigate new currency, wages, and taxes. Westerners adjusted to increased diversity in shopping habits and commuting patterns. Life, as it often does, found a gentle equilibrium, neither rushed nor forced. The cultural sphere also expanded, subtly but meaningfully. Museums opened their doors to new audiences, concert halls introduced programs that blended Eastern and Western traditions. Cinemas screened films that had been previously unavailable. All of this happened without fanfare. No sudden premieres or red carpets. Visitors moved through theaters, galleries, and cinemas slowly, absorbing the experience with quiet attention, perhaps marveling at small contrasts or noting humorous details in exhibitions. The wall itself, partially demolished but still present in sections, became a symbol of reflection rather than confrontation. Tourists arrived, of course, but not in overwhelming waves. They observed, photographed, and sometimes left small tokens of acknowledgement. Painted stones, gentle graffiti, or subtle sculptures placed nearby. Citizens occasionally joined them, sometimes offering a faintly ironic remark. "I watched it crumble slowly. Finally." Life's pace remained deliberate, unhurried, and human. Let's pause for a moment to think about social interactions. Formerly divided friends began tentative conversations. Colleagues adjusted to shared offices. Schoolchildren swapped stories about holidays on the other side. Conversations were not animated or dramatic. They were measured, observant, sometimes slightly awkward, but mostly sincere. The city was learning gently how to exist as a unified space, and people were discovering that even decades of separation could be bridged with quiet patience. Families continued to explore urban spaces. Parks that had once been strictly segregated now saw children from different neighborhoods playing together. Elderly residents discovered new cafes or benches, observing neighbors they had never met before, sometimes nodding politely, sometimes exchanging faint smiles. And through it all, Berlin maintained a calm, unhurried pace, allowing its citizens to acclimate to changes without forcing spectacle or dramatics. Even in entertainment, subtle shifts were occurring. Local theaters introduced plays that reflected a blend of Eastern and Western themes. Street musicians performed pieces that had been previously limited to one side of the city. Libraries stocked books that had once been rare or unavailable. And patrons, both young and old, absorbed these offerings slowly, quietly, without the kind of fevered excitement that sometimes accompanies cultural revolutions. The city, as always, adjusted at its own deliberate pace. One interesting phenomenon emerged in personal hobbies. East Berliners discovered new sports equipment, bicycles, and musical instruments, sometimes marveling at their availability, sometimes wondering if they should actually learn to use them. Westerners tried Eastern recipes, games, and art techniques, sometimes with mild confusion, often with gentle amusement. These small exchanges carried a subtle cultural dialogue that didn't require political commentary, just human curiosity, patience, and observation. Let's also consider transportation, which quietly reshaped lives. Trains, buses, and trams gradually adjusted routes, schedules, and ticketing systems to accommodate citizens from both sides. Commuters learned new paths, sometimes pausing at intersections that had been checkpoints for decades, now open. Drivers navigated streets that had shifted in usage patterns, and cyclists discovered paths previously off limits. All of this happened without fanfare. No sudden crowds, just the soft hum of a city reconfiguring itself methodically. Even small bureaucratic interactions, registering for jobs, applying for permits, or exchanging identification, had a quietly transformative effect. Citizens, now traversing formerly divided systems, discovered similarities and differences, learning the mechanics of unified governance in a gentle, step-by-step.
Part 4. The Legacy of the Wall. Quiet Reflections and Reunification. Welcome back, friends. If you're still tucked in or comfortably seated, that's perfect. Tonight, we gently guide ourselves to the conclusion of our slow journey through Berlin's transformation after the wall fell. This part focuses on the final adjustments, personal reflections, and the subtle legacies that remain. No urgency, no drama. Just the quiet unfolding of a city and its people rediscovering life. By 1990, reunification was no longer a tentative idea, but a deliberate, carefully orchestrated reality. Laws, policies, and systems slowly merged, often in ways that would seem mundane to anyone listening. Tax codes were harmonized, postal systems were integrated, public transport schedules were adjusted. Citizens from both sides learned the gentle art of patience as government offices worked through the inevitable paperwork. East Berliners discovered new bureaucratic forms with a quiet mix of curiosity and mild bewilderment. Do I really need 3 forms to register a bicycle? Someone might ask. And the clerk, with calm precision, replies, yes, but at least you're allowed to ride it anywhere now. Small victories, soft humor, and measured progress defined these months. Education continued its slow transformation. Schools merged curricula, teachers adapted lesson plans, and students from both sides found themselves in shared classrooms. Western students introduced Eastern students to new music, literature, and cultural references. Eastern students shared stories, historical perspectives, and their own slightly sarcastic observations about decades of separation. Classrooms became spaces of gentle exploration rather than competition, learning not just history, but the subtle art of coexistence. Families, too, settled into new rhythms. Parents cautiously explored neighborhoods that had been closed for decades, finding bakeries, parks, and playgrounds that now seemed welcoming. Children laughed in streets that had once been patrolled checkpoints. Grandparents slowly adjusted to seeing distant relatives in person, often over quiet meals rather than dramatic reunions. Life was reassembling itself at a gentle pace, like assembling a puzzle where each piece fits slowly, carefully, and perfectly over time. Work life gradually adapted as well. East Berliners entered industries previously unavailable to them. Offices merged departments, sometimes with mild confusion over titles and procedures, but always with deliberate precision. West Berliners learned new habits, sometimes observing minor quirks in paperwork or office etiquette and occasionally chuckling under their breath at the differences. And all of this happened without spectacle. There were no fireworks or fanfare, just the measured cadence of urban life adapting to a new reality. Even leisure time carried subtle shifts. Cafes, restaurants, and bars that had been exclusively Western or Eastern began to welcome new patrons. Music blended from both sides of the city, creating a soft, eclectic soundtrack for life. Libraries offered books from both traditions. Movie theaters screened films that merged perspectives and storytelling styles. And patrons absorbed all of this quietly, sometimes with mild amusement, sometimes with contemplative smiles. Culture became a slow bridge, linking past and present without the need for dramatic announcements. One interesting aspect was the small, human stories of curiosity and exploration. Former East Berliners visited Western neighborhoods, noting differences in architecture, street signs, and even shop displays. Former West Berliners wandered into Eastern streets, marveling at apartment blocks, courtyards, and playgrounds that had been invisible for decades. Children discovered parks that had been off-limits, playground equipment they had never used, and neighbors they had never met. Everyone explored with a gentle, measured curiosity, as if Berlin itself were a living museum of small surprises. Transportation, of course, remained a subtle but significant adjustment. Commuters navigated streets that had once been divided, and public transit slowly optimized routes for an increasingly interconnected population. Drivers and cyclists adjusted to new traffic patterns, and pedestrians naturally took their time discovering shortcuts, quiet alleys, and little urban treasures that had been hidden by decades of separation. Life moved carefully, with minor hiccups, but always forward. The wall itself, though partially demolished, retained quiet significance. Some sections became public art installations with murals, graffiti, and subtle commentary on human resilience. People took photographs, left small tokens, or simply paused to reflect. Children climbed over remaining slabs, sometimes leaving playful messages or carvings. Tourists observed quietly, capturing images not of conflict, but of subtle coexistence. And citizens, the wall became a gentle teacher, a reminder of past divisions, yes, but also of patience, adaptation, and human connection. Even humor found its place in this evolving city. Shopkeepers labeled products with slightly ironic messages, like, "Now with fully accessible chocolate," or "Q's optional, happiness guaranteed." Cafes offered East meets West specials with quiet winks, and citizens occasionally exchanged sardonic comments about bureaucratic adjustments, always with measured, calm amusement. Life, in its slow unfolding, contained moments of levity that were understated but meaningful. Political life continued its deliberate pace. West and East German leaders met, discussed, revised, and signed treaties with quiet precision. International observers noted progress, but Berliners went about their routines without fanfare. Citizens adjusted to new voting systems, tax codes, and public services, often with mild curiosity rather than anxiety.
Even negotiations that might have seemed tense were handled with calm decorum, occasionally interrupted by small bureaucratic mishaps, which were met with gentle humor. Of course, a stamp is missing, because why not? Economic life, too, evolved gradually. Shops adjusted prices, wages were harmonized, and employment opportunities slowly expanded. East Berliners discovered new industries, financial services, and consumer goods. West Berliners learned patience as markets recalibrated, and everyone at some point noticed minor surprises: a product they hadn't seen in years, a new cafe with a strangely familiar menu, or a street they had never walked before. These small discoveries, subtle but steady, marked the slow heartbeat of a reunited city. Even in cultural institutions, small, reflective changes occurred. Museums curated exhibitions that acknowledged both East and West perspectives. Libraries introduced new materials. Theaters and concert halls experimented with mixed programming, subtly blending traditions. And visitors, both local and international, absorbed all of this quietly, noticing details, contrasts, and minor ironies without rushing. Life moved deliberately, thoughtfully, and gently. Perhaps most touching were the stories of personal reflection. Citizens who had grown up with the wall observed its partial demolition with mild awe, sometimes gently tapping concrete slabs or pausing to leave small inscriptions. Children who had never known the division played around remnants of barriers, curious but unafraid. Early residents walked past sections of wall, reflecting quietly, occasionally sharing a soft smile with neighbors. And through all this, citizens discovered that history could be both instructive and gentle, less a dramatic performance than a series of small, patient lessons. Social interactions, too, evolved in quiet ways. Former neighbors who had been separated by concrete reconnected through casual visits, shared meals, and small exchanges of gifts. Students from East and West discovered mutual interests, quietly blending habits, humor, and routines. Colleagues navigated newly merged offices, sometimes chuckling at procedural differences. And families continued to explore neighborhoods, parks, and shops, all in measured steps, allowing curiosity to guide them without overwhelming their daily rhythms. Let's also note the subtle emergence of collective memory. The wall, partially absent but partially present, became both artifact and reflection. Citizens shared stories of past separation, often with faint humor, like, "Remember when we couldn't get oranges?" Or, "I had to take a 2-hour detour just to meet my cousin." Museums, schools, and public spaces slowly incorporated these narratives, offering gentle lessons to new generations, all while preserving the calm dignity of everyday life. Even leisure time remained slow and deliberate. Cafes, restaurants, and cinemas attracted patrons from both sides, merging tastes, preferences, and cultural habits. Street musicians played softly, blending melodies that had once been heard separately. Parks hosted children from previously divided neighborhoods who discovered one another in measured, playful steps. And through all this, Berlin moved quietly, thoughtfully, and embracing a rhythm that reflected decades of patience, observation, and adaptation. And finally, we can reflect on the enduring legacy of the wall not as a dramatic symbol of division, but a gentle teacher of resilience, patience, and adaptation.